Hello, everyone. So today we're going to talk about data annotation and tools that involve us to take data in typically low resource languages, and I'm going to concentrate on low resource languages rather than languages that already have lots of resources. Um, you will always need some annotated data. If you're going to work in a language, you can't just say, I've got all my data, here's the data, the raw text or speech in the target language. You're going to need some sort of annotation, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what to annotate and how. We're going to talk about who's going to do the annotation: natives, non-natives, crowd workers. We're going to talk about measuring agreement between the people doing the labeling. And we're going to talk about the types of tasks that are relatively easy to do and the type of tasks that are relatively hard to do. And then we're going to talk about some various toolkits that are out there to be able to help you when you're trying to do an annotation task. Okay. NLP support for a language doesn't just mean that you have the raw text. You probably want to have something, you want to know something that can test your models and find out how good it is. So you want some good labeled data to show that you're doing something with the language, that your models are actually useful in some way. You need good training data. And yes, there are unsupervised techniques and cross-lingual transfer techniques, but ultimately you want to compare with some level of training data. Okay, you might only have test data to work out whether things are happening, but having training data would be useful too, always, even if your cross-lingual cross-transfer techniques are working well. You probably want to have data to measure your progress in your model. So as you're getting better, whether that's being a bootstrapping technique, you want to know whether you're getting better. And so you sort of need dev test data in order to be able to do that. And you probably want to also know whether the labeling you're doing is ultimately useful or not. Does it make things better for whatever you're trying to do? Are you improving your translation? Are you improving your information extraction? Are you improving your question answering or dialogue systems for your end users? So you want to be able to test whether you're actually getting better. Who can do the labeling? Um, Realistically, this is often true for major resource languages as well, is that they're probably going to be non-expert native speakers. And when I say non-expert, that means they don't have a degree in linguistics. They don't have linguistic awareness even about their language. They might not know what the word noun means, or they might think the word noun and verb only applies to a later language that they've learned in life and doesn't apply to their own language. This is quite often that you only become aware of some level of linguistics once you start learning other languages and don't think it really applies and have never really thought about it in terms of your own language. You should also be aware that not everybody is literate in languages that they're native in. So in other words, they may be able to answer questions about the language. They may be able to recognize it. They may even be able to read it, but they might not be very good at writing. And this is surprisingly common. So even though the person may be quite literate in some other language, English, Putonghua, or whatever, when they're actually doing the target language that they're a native speaker in or near native speaker, writing is hard and it takes a long time. It's not that they cannot do it, it's just that it's not going to be very fast. Okay. So this actually also, you have to be aware that the people that you're dealing with, usually for native speakers, is that they're might not be available next week. They're only going to be available short term. We have been in the position where we had to buy pizzas in order to be able to interact with a native speaker. And so he would only come because he would make more money delivering pizzas than what he would by us paying him per hour. So we ended up, ordering pizzas in order to be able to get him to help us out, because he was, I think it was a Pashto speaker, in order to be able to get us to help. You might be able to find expert natives who have a linguistic awareness about the language, understand what machine learning is, understand what NLP is. They sometimes can be found by the internet. They sometimes are people at universities in the target country where the language is spoken. Be aware of their motivation for what they're doing, because it could affect their help that they're going to do. I'm not saying that in a negative way, but it's important to realize, are they an advocate for the language? Are they a teacher with strong prescriptive views of what the language should be? Okay, because often when low resource languages, people have quite strong views about how the language should be written and might not be willing to accommodate when you're dealing with other language and to say, oh no, that's a dialect, that's not appropriate, and we don't want to use it. And that might not be what you ultimately want to do. Um, I have been in the position where DARPA has been funding us to do work on Farsi, Iranian, and Persian, and we have arranged to be able to work with people in Iran to be able to help us do the work. And DARPA said, although at some level they don't mind about that, actually it's illegal for them to work with people in Iran, and therefore we could not continue that. So be aware that there might be some interesting or novel political issues in finding your expert natives. Okay. Um, where do you get expert non-natives? So these are people who are linguistically aware, maybe even NLP aware, but they don't really speak the target language. They might have some knowledge of the language, but they might not actually be natives. You can still get them to do things. And surprisingly, you can still get non-natives to do relatively interesting things. Depending on their awareness of the language, they can do a lot more. They can often correct named entity labeling and say, oh, that's just wrong, or oh, that one's been missed. They might only capture that for international words and not just every word. It might also be reasonable that they can go through examples and go, that's just a bad example, it's long, or it's not got the right type of text in it, and therefore we should ignore it. And you can often do that even in languages you don't know. And also, for example, if you want to remove the code switch things with English, if it's with English, an English speaker can go in and go, oh, that's got English words in it, let's ignore it. Okay, so that is something that is reasonable, and you should be aware that expert non-natives may be available to be able to do some of the tasks when you don't have natives available. And often you're in a situation where you're working in languages where you do not have access to any native speakers, or only very limited access to native speakers. Where might you be able to find labelers? Well, Amazon Mechanical Turk is a good place, but the lower the resource the language, and the less you may find people who can speak that language. Amazon Turkers often have a fairly wide set of language support, but also be aware that what often happens with Amazon Turkers, if you ask them to do something in a target language, they'll just use Google Translate and try and do it, because they're interested in the money, not in helping out for the particular language. We've done various tricks to try to make it harder for people who are using translation to be able to do it. We do recordings in the target language and give a little story and ask a question, and they have to type in the answer. And we only let them continue if they actually get that answer right. Although it was pointed out that in one of the recent tests where we did this for Hindi, we had 3 questions and I got 2 of them right, just based on my very limited knowledge of Hindi and a guest. And I got 2 out of 3, and so maybe that's not enough, okay? And maybe it gets an almost native or somebody who knows something about it, like non-native Hindi speakers, as there are many of them. In-country labelers, this is often useful if you're looking for a particular language. There's probably a community that has that information, so maybe you can go to a university. It's always a good place to start. You go and find a linguistics department or computer scientist who might be able to help you. But be aware that it might be hard to pay these people, and it's always nice to be able to find a way to pay these people. It might be completely illegal. You're not allowed to send money to Iran from the United States at the moment. And there may not be a way to actually pay. There may be other things you can do, but it might also be hard for your university to do the things that you want to do. You send them laptop as a present, but it might be hard to get the university to pay for that when you're going to send it to some random third world country, and therefore that might be an issue. But be aware that there may be issues, but we often find techniques to get around that. Um, Often translation services have access to people of lots of different languages. They've already collected many, a network of people who work part-time in order to be able to work in the language. And a language translator may be able to do different types of work once you contact them rather than just doing translation. I say taxi drivers, I mean Uber drivers and Lyft drivers too. One of the things that's actually pretty interesting that in general, um, Uber taxi drivers are multilingual. They're often relatively well educated, and it might be that they've only just moved to whatever country you're actually in. And it's always interesting to ask them what languages they speak. I know that Laurie Levin always does it and keeps record because she can go back and do it. And one of the little stories I remember her saying was she said to one of her taxi drivers, "Oh, you speak this language. We do some work on that." And they said, "Oh, is it the Lorelei DARPA work?" And she said, "Yes." "How did you know that?" He says, "Oh, I'm already doing something for somebody else who I met was a passenger." So often the taxi drivers, when they speak interesting languages, are aware that they're already doing things for DARPA or whoever. Um, don't underestimate CMU campus. CMU campus has an awful lot of speakers from all over the world, and there's quite a wide language distribution. Now, be also aware that sometimes when you're doing target languages, the type of country that you're dealing with doesn't have people who go into tertiary education, and therefore they never end up at CMU. But there's still an interesting group there that's also worthwhile trying to see if you can find any. There might be a student group, or if you find somebody in a related country, you might be able to find other people. If you're looking for Pakistanis, go and ask the Indians. They usually know who the Pakistanis are, even if you don't know who the Pakistanis are. And the Pakistanis might know who the Afghanis are, or the people who speak Pashto and Dari. Again, CMU people, especially if they're not American, it can be quite hard to pay them. And so you should be aware that that may be an issue, and you've got to find interesting but legal ways to pay them. You can't pay them cash, but you can give them something else. Be aware that paid labeling does not require IRB approval, the institutional review board that you need to get approval from whenever you do human subject experiments. Labeling is not human subject experimentation, okay? Nor should it be. It's a different task. It's a paid task. Now, if you're doing unpaid labeling, you have to make some decision about that. That's not as clear because maybe you're convincing them to do it because they are doing some linguistic experiment. Be aware that you can still discuss results and comparisons of your labelers, but there is a boundary there that you have to be aware that you could be crossing when you start actually doing human subject experimentation. And so maybe you do need approval, okay? So be aware of that there's some choice that actually happens there, but labeling itself is not human subject experimentation. And actually many of the tasks that we do that are human subject experimentation around there actually only need to get exemption, but you still need to get that exemption from the IRB in order to be able to continue with what you're doing. Let's talk a little bit more about the non-native labeling. It's quite interesting, and especially when we're dealing with low resources, we may not be able to find sufficient native speakers to actually do things, and therefore we're actually using maybe someone who's competent in the language or aware of the language, or we might actually be using people who don't know anything about the language, okay? Now, non-natives can still do things. They're usually slower than natives, but often they're more expert, and therefore they can do more complex tasks, or at least make some decisions about complex tasks. Topic labeling for articles news articles is something that isn't impossible to do, even if you're not a native of the language. It's fairly easy to look through a newspaper article if it's in a script that you're familiar with, and look at the English words in it and make decisions about whether this is about international politics or not. If it talks about Washington, if it talks about the EU, probably it's something about politics. And that can be done by non-native. They don't have to know the language. It is pretty important to project whatever the script is into a readable script for the non-native to do it. And so sometimes it's much better to be able to get a romanization because it's much easier to remember. I understand Chinese Hanzi at a fair amount, and I can remember characters that I've never seen before because I have a mental model about them through my knowledge of Japanese, but I'm much, much slower at it than if it was projected into a pinyin. I wouldn't get the same meaning as fast, so maybe I want both, but I can remember strings of pinyin, even though they're nonsense to me, much easier than I can remember strings of Hanzi, even if they may not be nonsense to me. And for example, if you're working in Indian languages, if you project a romanization, often, we did this with Oriya, where we projected into romanization, and Hindi speakers can recognize lots of words in there. They don't get all of the meaning. Bengali speakers can do better than Hindi speakers, but they can still remember it better and recognize things rather than looking over an unfamiliar script. Even though you can sort of pick that up, it's much easier, even if it's nonsense to you, if it's in a familiar script. You can do confirmation of named entities. So one of the things that we did, which is very successful, is like, here's a labeled named entity, is it named entity? And what you do is you put it into Google Images and you have a look at the images. If a picture comes up of a person multiple times as the same person, it's probably a person name. If a picture comes up of a building or of a park or of clearly a cityscape, then it could be that that's the name of a city or a town. Okay, and that is surprisingly reliable, and Google actually indirectly collecting that information, and you can do it in the native script. In fact, it's better to do it in the native script because there's more likely to have a strong accuracy between the actual form of the written form and the pictures when you're actually doing it. Be aware that when you're dealing with languages you don't know, there are often really stupid things in the data that you maybe can't see, but non-natives are just spend a little time of looking at it, but looking at articles that are too long, they're too short, or they're just too weird. It's like, yeah, this article seems to have an awful lot of numbers in it, so let's just ignore it. It doesn't have lots of text in it. Also, because we're dealing with Unicode, hopefully, or you might be dealing with some other script, the encoding can be messed up, and it can be arbitrarily messed up, and you can often see that. And it might just be that there are things like the diacritics have disappeared because they've been lost somehow, and therefore you want to maybe ignore that data or get rid of it. Now, most people, when they're reading a target language, are relatively used to reading things that are wrong. So if you show data to an Arabic speaker, and instead of it running right to left, it's running left to right, they can still read it, but it's weird. And you, I'm assuming you don't read Arabic, might not be able to see that it's wrong, okay? You might be able to immediately tell whether something's simplified Chinese or whether it's traditional Chinese, and therefore you can go, yeah, I think that's not Putonghua, I think that's Cantonese, or I think that's from Taiwan, rather than mainland China, while me, who knows something about the language, might not be able to do that immediately, okay? And so these are the sort of things that can be a little bit hard, but you can sort of learn some things about it. It's also possible as non-native to be able to look into things like if parallel sentences are misaligned, because you can begin to recognize patterns and you think, wait, that's a little weird. The length isn't right, or wait, that word appears in both of these sentences and it appears in the previous two, but not these ones. Therefore there's something special that's going on there, and therefore you can do it. Non-native recall is usually pretty low, so it's pretty hard for somebody who's not a native speaker to recognize all of the named entities. But the named entities they do recognize, they're usually pretty precise at. So you get pretty high precision out of a non-native, but the recall sucks. And so you can be aware of that when you're actually doing it. And as I say, sometimes non-natives might be the only thing that you actually have. What can be labeled, okay? Overall aspects of the language are actually quite important. So one of the things that you can't do as non-native, and one of the things you can use a native speaker for, rather than actually labeling, they can tell you something about the language, which you can't do. You say, I've got all this data, so it must all be in insert name of low resource language. But you show it to native and they might be say things like, yeah, that's a weird dialect, or that's not actually how we speak the language. That's how the one country over speaks the language. And yeah, we understand it all and we sometimes speak like that, but that's not how we speak in our country. That's somebody else's version of the language. And that happens, okay? A lot. I remember when we were doing Kirawanda, we were also had Burundi, and the Burundi and Kirawanda are mutually intelligible, but they're different, okay? And when DARPA gave us the data, they never identified that these were different. And when we were listening to some of the data, I got the impression that this was a different language. It had much more borrowed French in it. It was acoustically very different. And me and David eventually decided that this was actually not Kirawanda, but it was the Burundi. I don't know if that's called Burundi. And we decided to keep it, even though it was really quite a distinct dialect from the Kirawanda that we were dealing with. And a native speaker can do that almost immediately. I mean, sometimes you have to prompt them to say, you know, where's this from? What type of data is this? And even if you know this is from the radio station news, you know, you want them to confirm and say this is the radio station news, and they don't want, you want to confirm that it's not, you know, a satirical TV show that's pretending to be the news, because that could be different. Is it printed well? Are there missing diacritics? Are these full sentences? These are things that you might not be able to tell, but a native speaker can immediately tell you that. And it's a good idea to ask them about it. You know, tell me about this text. What type of text is it? Where does it come from? And they go, oh, this is actually from the Quran. Okay, and now you know it's from the Quran, and that could be very different from the normal things that get posted on Twitter. Okay, or these are lyrics from a rap. That's different than what would be from a news form, and you won't be able to see that. Okay, you have to remember that you, as a non-native speaker, cannot see those errors in the text. Okay, it's sort of beyond your capability, and that's why you want to ask a native speaker about it. And just having a short discussion with them can actually help you sort out your data a lot better. Remember, when you're talking about linguistic issues with non-linguists, they won't understand what it is. So if you ask them about, you know, tell me the nouns in this, they might not know what that means. Or tell me about the conjunctions. They don't know what that means. You have to give examples. If you give examples of saying, look, here are 4 words. Are there any other words that are like these? They might be able to do it. But be aware that they are probably not linguistically aware of their native language. Okay. And you may need to get into discussions with them. You can't just get them to write things down. You might want to ask them, how do numbers work in the language? Give them some examples, get them to explain it. And then you can work out something about numbers. And it might be that there's a native script, and there might be the use of the Roman script for different types of numbers. If you want to find out about morphology, if you want to find out about, say, agreement, you might not be able to say, is there agreement between subject-object or subject-verb in the language? And the person will go, wait, what? And so you might have to give examples of saying, you know, how do you say, I saw the girl in the park versus I saw the girls in the park, okay? And you be aware of non-trivial cultural things when you're giving examples of that. Try to be as culturally independent as possible, but don't use iPhone as your only noun, because it could be that iPhone is treated differently than native words in the language. Truly, they may have a different distribution of whether they have agreement. Their pluralization could be different, because they could have a borrowed form that's quite different. Think about Latin words in English have got a different plural sometimes than what they have in the standard adding an S on the end of it. So be aware that you might have to explain your linguistic terms to someone, even though they're completely fluent in English, and they might even understand these linguistic terms in English, but they've just never thought about it for that target language. Make sure that you have clearly defined tasks, um, things that are reasonably easy to understand. So you can't talk about NER labeling to people who've never considered it before, but you can talk about proper noun labeling, so people names and place names, and that works pretty well. Okay. Sentiment probably works quite well. You can get away with it. Translation works pretty well, but always be aware if you're getting people to translate things into their native language. It's better to do that because they're going to be more fluent, although it could be more useful for you to get them translation out of it into English. But we be aware that translation ease is not as native as what it would be. And if you ask an Indian to translate English into their native language, it's hard for them to do that because many of the English words don't have good translations into their language that they speak, and therefore they end up just doing borrowed forms, and that might not be exactly what you want because it might be too anglicized. Um, Speech transcription sort of works as well. So you give them some speech, ask them to write it down, assuming that they're fluent in writing. Okay, although be aware that they may often transcribe in a proper form that rather than what's actually spoken. So, for example, in Arabic dialects, if you ask Arabic speakers and even Arabic speakers of the Arabic dialects to write down what was said, they'll often effectively translate it into modern standard Arabic. And so they'll do some choice of form when they're actually writing it down and do some modification. And therefore, it won't have a perfect ideal alignment. And explaining that to them could be particularly hard. And the English equivalent would be, if the person said, I'm going to go to, maybe the person who transcribes it right down as I am going to rather than I'm gonna go. So these reduced forms might not appear in the written form, and that could be a problem depending what you want in the transcription. You really want to define the task. You want to be simple. You want to put a lot of effort in making it easy for people to do this. So put effort in displaying the data so that it's easy for the person to do it. So it's sort of one click or just type in an answer. You don't want them to have to do lots of scrolling and lots of page jumping because that slows them down significantly. It disrupts their task. And it's much easier if they just go, yes, 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 no, 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 yes, yes, yes. Even if they occasionally make errors rather than going, wait, where I'm in the task and I have to do that, I have to do that. Make sure they only do one task at a time. You say it might be easy for them to label things like named entities, but also what the verbs are. And let's do semantic roles at the same time because they're looking at the same sentence. But that can be very much slower for the person doing it. So getting them to do one task at a time means that they could be much more efficient in doing it. Choose the right tool to display the data. It might be some general thing like a spreadsheet, but make sure that you've designed that spreadsheet to make it easier that they're not doing side scrolling all the time or whatever. Make sure it might be a custom tool, it might be a labeling tool. We'll talk a little bit about these in a minute. Investigate how people actually do the labeling task, maybe even watch them. I mean, be nice about it, don't spy on them, and find out how you can make that more efficient. Ask them, saying like, how do you think this would be quicker? And they'd say, these sentences are too long to see in the screen, and could you get shorter ones? Or is there a better way to display things? Or like the font's too small, so I can't actually see it. It's really hard to read. Or, these don't have all the diacritics in it, so I'm sort of making it up. And these are good things to actually address to try and make it easy. So talking to the labelers to make it an easier task for them, they'll be happy about it and you get more data. I'm going to actually talk about one particular labeling task that we've done. Actually going to put a meta piece of information in here. Today, there'll be no discussion points. So this lecture is maybe going to be a little longer than normal. So we're not actually going to have a discussion point, although there is a task that I'd like you to do at the end in playing with one of the toolkits. So here, what I'm going to actually talk about is a particular labeling task that we did a number of years ago on building pronunciation lexicons in new languages. There was a bunch of us actually both at CMU and in South Africa who independently came up with the same technique, and then we shared our methods for doing it. I'm eventually going to lead into issues on how you do this with the end user, but I'm first going to explain what the task is. When you're trying to build a pronunciation lexicon for a new language, what do you do? Some languages are much easier than others. What you want to have is whatever the graphemes are, and you want to learn what the graphemes, the phonemes are. What we actually discovered is if you start off with, say, 100 frequent words in the language and actually transcribe them into the pronunciation, and then use that to build a grapheme to phoneme prediction rule, machine learned rules, to try to learn that mapping. And what you can do is then pick new words, and then you can give them to a speaker of the language and say, is this pronounced correctly or not? Okay, they can correct them, or they can say yes and no, and then we can move on and we can incrementally improve our grapheme to phoneme rules. So we have a set of rules. We're asking a question whether the answer is right on the new example, and we'll either correct it and add that to our data set so we can update, or they can exclude it or whatever. We built the system. It worked quite well. It allowed us to be able to build things faster. We tested it, offline with actual examples of improving in English, and it actually worked pretty well. And we did it for a bunch of other languages. And Marilee Deval, who did it as part of her PhD student, she's a professor in South Africa now. She did the experiments for most of the Southern African languages. And we were doing it for a number of European languages, and also Arabic dialects, and also Persian and Pashto. And we did experiments about how fast we could do it and how to make this easiest for the users to actually do that. So there's this task. We had to present it to the user. And this is what I'd actually like to talk about things that you could do to try to get that presented. So what happens is we have the word. In this case, we're showing an example with English. We have the word, and we give the guest pronunciation. And what we can say is accepted. We can say skip this word. It's not a word. Doesn't matter about it. Or we can say remove this word. It's not a word. We don't ever want to deal with it. Skip the word means it could come back later. Okay, and you can just edit it and correct it. Okay. We also have an option to be able to click on here to hear it. Actually, hear it with the synthesizer. We didn't do this at first, and Marilee Deval noticed that when you gave people the examples, that their brain got tired after a while, and they started just going, yeah, that's okay. And they thought it was right, but it wasn't actually right. While it was easy, or at least having the multimodality of giving the information was easier for them to hear whether it was right or not. And so we started doing this too, and it definitely makes a difference. And in the end, we actually made it so that it would always say it. Okay. And then you could go, yep, that's right. Or skip this word or edit it. Often it would be the wrong vowel, and especially in English. So you'd want to be able to do that. And so those options are those things that you discover, giving other information, multimodality, doing the alignment, remove this word and never let it come back again. We did this because you ended up with like random bits of HTML or the wrong language because there's some code switching going on that you didn't realize that you actually want to exclude this thing. The other thing that we discovered that in general, fix it if there's one or two errors, and do not fix it if there's more than that. Just skip it, because later it's going to be better. Okay. And the other thing is make sure that people sees that they're getting better, make sure that they can see that things are improving over time. And one of the things you should not do, which is on here, is showing the how well you're improving over time and telling people that you're incrementing to 8 decimal places after the point in percentage. So you do one more and 2 of these numbers change at the end is unbelievably depressing. Okay, because it means you've got 100 million words that you have to do. So be a little careful about that, and don't do 8 places after the point when you're telling somebody. It's a good idea to have that. Okay. So here's another one where it's trying to say the word gene. Actually, it's quite interesting. It's not clear what the pronunciation of that might be, but notice it didn't get the J at all, and it does a double N, which probably isn't right, and so you want to be able to correct that or skip it. Okay, so that's an example of the things that you might want to do when you're trying to tell people, give people a form, and we learned from how people were doing it in order to be able to improve that and give them a better interface. And that's often a good thing to be able to do. When you get people to do this, there's a number of things that you want to care about when you're checking the labeling that they're doing. No matter how interested they're in, no matter how dedicated they are to it, you want to make sure that they're actually contributing, okay? And there's 4 different things that we'd like to address while looking at this. We'd like to check for correctness. Are they doing the right thing? We'd like to check that multiple people are doing the same thing, because often there's multiple correct things, and you'd like people to be consistent on how they're actually doing it, especially multiple labelers. We want to make sure that they are efficient in doing it, and we're not wasting their time and wasting our time in order to be able to get the right result. And we also want to make sure that the labeling that we're doing actually helps something downstream. Is there something that you can use this labeling for that shows that it's actually valuable? And actually telling your labelers that thank you for doing all of that because you've now improved our task, and we're now up at 88% correct rather than the 81% that we were at the beginning of the week. They feel they're contributing, and that's a good thing. And of course it's a good thing because now you've got, information that can tell you whether you're actually getting better in your task. Checking for correctness. Okay, so this can be hard in a novel language, but it's sort of a good idea to have some golden data that has got the right information in it, and maybe you get your single expert to do it or get them to do it multiple times and decide this is correct. And then what you want to do when you give it to other people who are maybe less trained, do they get the same answer? Do they mark the same named entities? Do they transcribe the same thing when it's when they write down what they hear? And we'd like to find out about that. And so that's one way to test it. Another way to test it is to test between different labelers and try to find out whether they're doing the same thing. The simplest possible way is, how often do they do exactly the same thing? Now, that sort of works, but it isn't quite right, because they might occasionally just do the same thing anyway. So there's a notion of, got 4 labels, and you ask people to do it, so 25% of the time they might randomly be doing it. So 25% times 25% is where they might actually agree, but typically these things are not equiprobable, and some things are way more probable than others. And so people are maybe going, if it's unusual, I'll do category 3. If it's a common thing, I'll just do category 1. And multiple people are doing that. And you would like to get a better measure of whether people are actually agreeing, not just on the most frequent one, but they're agreeing on the least frequent ones as well. There's a measure to do this. It's called kappa, but there's multiple versions of kappa depending on what you're doing. Cohen's kappa, which is maybe the most common one, actually only tells you the difference between 2 labelers, or maybe a gold standard and an actual labeler. And what it's trying to do is trying to give you how often the labeler agrees, and taking into account what chance is. The formula is there to do it, but remember it's only between 2. And so if you've got 5 labelers, you're going to have to do n cross n to be able to get that and find out who's the most reliable between each other, which is often an interesting thing to do, because you discover that people actually have different levels of agreement between each other. Kappa scores bigger than about 0.6, depends who you're talking to, is considered good. 0.8 is considered to be very good, but it also depends on the complexity of your task, whether you would expect people to be that good. Kappa scores of less than 20 are sucky, so I wouldn't trust that. And you can get negative kappa scores as well, and that means people are not agreeing. In fact, it means that they're worse than chance. There's also a thing called Fleecy's kappa, which actually allows you to look at multiple raters and see how they agree. And there's also a thing called Krippendorf's alpha that's actually a better measure of kappa. No, I haven't written that on the form. And you can do that. And typically when you're talking about this in the paper, This is something that you definitely want to calculate. But when you're doing labeling for the first time, you really want to find out whether people are agreeing on the task. Because just because you think the task is well defined, it doesn't mean the labeler thinks it's well defined. And this is not because they're cheating. It's not because they're not typing the right thing. It's just they think the task is a different task. You also want to have a look at within the particular label. Are they being consistent? And maybe you occasionally want to repeat data and see whether you get the same score label for it, just to make sure that they can actually do the task and they're also not just doing A. So you want to make sure that's the case. You also maybe want to look at the range of labels that they do. So imagine they're doing a 1 to 5 thing, maybe on say sentiment. You want to know, are they using the whole scale, just part of the scale? Are they skewed to one side to the other? Do you want to normalize that particular labeler when you're looking across other labelers? Do you want to see the distribution of, even if they're discrete scores between different labelers and people are using the same thing? And another thing that you should do that you would not do in a human subject form is you discuss the inconsistencies. Remember, you're trying to get consistent labels. You're not trying to do a human experiment to find out whether people can agree on sentiment. What you're actually trying to get is an agreement on sentiment. So what you want to do is when people disagree, get them to talk to each other and say, why did you give a 1 for this and the other person gave a 5? Okay. And someone says, well, it was a Star Wars movie, so it had to be bad. And the other one said, well, it was a Star Trek movie, so it had to be good. And so their prior might have affected their scores, or there might be some other reason that, or some other piece of information that something like, oh, don't you know that kids, when they use the word bad, it means good. And therefore, it's worthwhile talking about those. And that's something you can do when you're labeling. Okay. And so having people talk about their inconsistencies actually will make future labeling better. And maybe people will change their mind about how to do it and they will converge on the method on how to do that. This brings in this whole thing about having a labeling guide. You should write down the requirements. I mean, it depends on what they're doing, but sometimes this is a very good thing to do. Most complex labeling tasks have an explicit labeling guide where the rules are written down. And we're not doing that to make your life harder. It's because once they're written down, it's easier to talk about them. It's easier to discover the exceptions and decide whether they are exceptions or not. Okay. When you're writing a labeling guide, it's a good idea to give actual examples of this is one of these, this is one of those, this is an ambiguous case. Okay. And therefore you should mark it as ambiguous. Okay. So for example, I know that the LDC NIST named entity labeling guide says that gods are not named entities. Okay, so you're not supposed to mention gods as and label them as named entities. It has been decided that we've not to do that. So sorry, Thor, you get left out. I'm going to give an explicit example about that. I remember when we were doing Lorelei, we were looking at earthquakes being reported in Uyghur, the language spoken in Western China. It's a Turkic language. And one of the things, especially on Twitter, that would happen is people would be commiserating with those who had misfortune of being affected by the earthquake. And there is a particular phrase, which is from the Quran, that says, may Allah give you relief. Okay, and is the translation of the English word relief. And one of the things that we were labeling this data, automatically labeling this data, is who's providing medical support, who's providing infrastructure support. So we actually cared about the word relief, and we would try to identify who was giving the relief and when it was going to happen. And we were ending up labeling these, Allah will send relief. Allah means God, for those of you who don't know that. Which was really just English equivalent, or at least discourse equivalent, is our prayers are with you. And we were labeling it as relief, and we were giving the subject of release as being Allah. And we were saying, and it hasn't come, and it doesn't say, and it's the UN and the Red Cross have already moved in, but Allah hasn't provided the relief yet. Okay, and Clearly, that was not the intention of the expression. And that's an example where you have to be a little careful of the names of gods, where they may get appear metaphorically or, as appeal to prayer, but they're not quite the same as saying the United Nations will provide relief. Okay. Checking for efficiency is important too. How fast are the labelers? Are they equal speed? Why? The one that's doing it fast, did they find a good way to lay things out on the screen to make things easier, or are they just better, less distracted? Or are they wrong? Okay, all of those are possibilities, but a good idea to investigate why. Okay, because you might be able to make your slower ones faster, or you might be able to make faster ones more accurate. Can you make the task more efficient? Maybe choose data that's more meaningful. For example, you choose articles with more NERs in them so that people are not reading an article that doesn't have any NERs in them, and therefore they're sort of wasting time. Is there a way that you might be able to do that so you can get more examples? This comes into this whole area of which things should I do next? And active learning is a particular form of machine learning that involves a human trying to label the hard cases, and Graham will be talking about that on Thursday afternoon. You maybe want to skip irrelevant data. We've seen this a number of times where the labeler goes into the document, they're going to label it, and they say, this is just a stupid document, or this is too similar to one of the previous ones. You won't get anything new, so let's just skip it. It's not labeled and not intending to do it. Or maybe only partially label it, is like you label the main NERs near the beginning, and then there's very few afterwards, or they just repeat, and maybe you just go, I've only labeled the first paragraph, and have ways to be able to do it. Identifying bottlenecks in the actual process could make things much more efficient. Okay. Checking for usefulness. Why are you doing the labeling? Does something actually get better with that labeling? So, maybe you should actually confirm that and have some downstream task that actually is getting better. As I say, your labelers will be happier if you can tell them, thank you for doing all of this. Thank you for doing the labeling. Our task just got better. Thank you for the contribution. Because they feel good about that. They feel part of it. And it's a good thing to actually try to do. What's the cost of errors in your labels? Is that important? Is it better to get more carefully correct things or to get more less correct things? I mean, you don't want things that are really bad, but can you afford 5% error? Can you afford 15% error? What's the cost of making sure? Do you have somebody go through it twice, a second person to do correction afterwards? Is that worth it, or is that not worth it? Okay. One of the things that's quite notable in the Penn Tree Bank that everybody's using for parsing is that at first they tried to do parsing of all of the complex nominals, and they discovered after a while that nobody could agree on how to be able to join these nouns and adjectives together properly. So they stopped doing it because it was taking too long, and there just wasn't enough agreement. So they just decided we're not going to do that. Choose the task. Easier things are like transcription of speech, translation, maybe place name ID, named entity labeling, sentiment labeling. These are easier to do. Much harder tasks, well, maybe question answering is possible as long as it's identifying a question. Maybe generating a question could be quite hard, but question answering, especially identify the segment that has the answer in it. Part of speech tagging requires more skill, and maybe you're going to do that automatically at first and try to do correction. Tree banking requires real knowledge of the language that native speakers alone might not have. Likewise with dependency parsing. What sort of toolkits are out there to help you? Well, a Google Doc or a spreadsheet can be pretty good. It can pretty efficient. People can access it anywhere, and you just say, go and do these, do number 1 to 20 or whatever, and that can work quite well. Make sure the layout is easy to the task, appropriate for the task. It's not always the case that spreadsheets are easy to see, especially if your eyesight isn't very good, speaking personally. They usually suck for me. Speech labeling, you can do transcription. So you listen to it, but you want to have a good replay option. You want to make sure that the segments are not too long, because if you play it and listen to it, you can remember up to about 10 to 15 words. But after that, you'll make errors. And so, if it's 30 words long, you've got to listen to the first bit that you've already transcribed, and then you have to listen to the second part. Spelling correction might be a good thing to do, because often in low resource languages, people don't have standardized spelling. and maybe you want to have a spelling corrector to make sure that it does become standardized. Um, and so that helps if you can actually do that. Phonetic labeling is hard task. You want to make sure you can see the waveform and the spectrogram, and there's different ways to display the spectrogram, and depending who you are, you want black and white spectrograms or you want color spectrograms. And if you don't do that, it's harder to read. Okay, and so you want to accommodate that for your actual person who's doing the labeling. Segmental labeling, maybe giving intents or maybe giving named entities, maybe politeness, maybe code switching information. You want to make sure that that's easy to do. You might have some custom tool to do this, probably web-based, although there's a bunch of tools that are already designed for doing a lot of this. There's a speech labeling tool called the LAN, which is usually looking at the data itself, and so you want to actually see the speech and be able to click on some parts of the speech. Wavesurfer 2 and BRAT. Text labeling, I'm going to talk a little bit more about a system called BRAT. BRAT is a labeling tool that allows you to do text forms. Oops, this is not what I wanted to do. That's an extra slide. Here's an example of BRAT. It runs in the browser. It doesn't require actual installation of anything, so you can use it and you can upload documents within the browser. It only works in Chrome and Safari. But here it's shown for named entity forms. You can customize it and interface it with Python and do things, which makes it a little bit easier, and design your own interfaces so that it works on your data and is easy for your labeler. But it also allows you to link things together. So here we have an example of entity linking in the tool, and therefore it's really quite easy to be able to do this non-linear segmental forms. We've used this tool for a number of things, and one of the things that we did was we got things to map at multiple levels. So we had things in the native script, we had things in the phonetic script, we had things in the romanization of the original script, we had translations, and the words that we felt were the same were highlighted. That when you put your cursor over them, all the highlights of the original text, the phonetic form, the romanized form, and the translation, if there was one, were all highlighted, so you could sort of quickly see things, and it became much easier. And then you could actually label things and say this is named entity and this is a geopolitical entity or a person or whatever. Okay, because this is an important day in the United States, and we don't want to distract people from tasks that might help them vote, we will not hold a discussion meeting today, okay? But although there's no discussion point, the thing we would like you to do is run the BRAT tutorial so you learn something more about it. So if you go to that URL there, or you search for BRAT labeling, not BRAT on its own, you'll get something else. BRAT labeling, you'll be able to see this form. And it just goes through some interesting examples of labeling. And have a look over it and see if you understand about it. If you have any questions about it, or you have any comments about it, whether you think it was good, whether you think it was bad, feel free to post to the Piazza about it. Okay, that's it for today.